Thank you, Jill. Good evening, welcome. I have many family and friends who joined us today, so thank you to family and friends and everyone who's here tonight. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Andaleeb Banta. I'm going to begin by telling us about her professional accomplishments. She is currently the Andrew Mellon Senior Curator of Prints and Drawings at the National Gallery of Art. She has worked in many institutions. She was also the Senior Curator of Prints and Drawings and head of that department at the Baltimore Museum of Art. And that is where she curated a landmark, highly regarded, well-reviewed exhibition called Making Her Mark, a history of women artists in Europe from 1400 to 1800. She's also been the curator of American and European art at the Allen Memorial Art Museum at Oberlin College, which is an institution similar to us, being an academic art museum, as we are. And before I introduce one more professional experience, I want to say a brief note about something about the discipline of art history that I think is going to help us understand the contribution that Dr. Banta's work makes. So, art history, it comes together in the German university system in the 19th century. It's an era of the Enlightenment, and one thing it gets from that intellectual period of history is categories. We love our categories. We want to know when something was made, what culture made it, and some categories, like fine arts, we have these traditional categories that involve a sense of hierarchy. Fine arts, you have decorative arts. All I'm going to say is, thankfully, in more recent decades, those are brought into question. And Dr. Banta followed that impetus to make a great contribution with the exhibition Making Her Mark, a history of women artists in Europe. So I will leave her to say more. Last line on her resume, she was also assistant curator at the National Gallery of Art, where I had the pleasure of meeting her. At the time, I was an intern. This was my first year out of undergrad. I eventually found my way into the role of organizing social outings. And on the occasions when Andaleeb came to join us, I felt especially cool and grown up that an assistant curator was joining us interns. So now it's my great pleasure and a little bit surreal that she's Andrew Mellon Senior Curator, and now I've moved from intern to assistant curator to introduce her. So thank you very much for joining us, Andrew.
To be here. It is just a lovely, lovely opportunity. I have many thanks to John and Jill for their kind invitation to speak here today. This is my first visit to the Lowe and in fact the Miami metro area, so I was very eager to take them up on their invitation, particularly in February. You all didn't tell me though that it gets cold here. This is a little shocking, I gotta say. But it's better than DC, which I think is currently somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 degrees. So we'll take what we can get and move forward together. So when John reached out, he asked, here, let's get us where we're going, here we go. He asked if I would center my talk around the Lowe's painting of the Holy Family of the Saints Anne and John the Baptist, created in 1592 by the Italian artist Sofonisba Anguissola. I was happy to do so for a variety of reasons. Sofonisba Anguissola was one of the most famous women artists of her time, and as a result, she inspired subsequent generations of women to pursue professional careers in painting. My own research and curatorial work have centered on foregrounding European women artists active before 1800, and Sofonisba Anguissola stands as one of the high-profile figures of that period. There's the painting. For this talk, I plan to share some details about Sofonisba Anguissola's exceptional career, including the circumstances around her creation of the Lowe's painting, and then consider her situation in comparison to what we have come to learn about other women involved in artistic production during the broader pre-modern era. By all accounts, Sofonisba Anguissola's story is one of extraordinary accomplishment. Raised by an ambitious father of some regional standing in Cremona in northern Italy, and there he is, right there, this gentleman. She and her three sisters, who are shown in this painting, received an unusually erudite education at a moment in history where only the very elite women received any formal education at all. Her father's intellectual aspirations for his children are clear in his mythological names for Sofonisba's sisters, Elena, or Helen, Minerva, and Europa. He also ensured Sofonisba's success as a painter by sending her to train in the studio of the local artistic luminary Bernardino Campi. Using her family and herself as the subjects of her earlier work, Sofonisba established herself as a portraitist, particularly of the female members of her family, for whom she also functioned as a professional mentor. Her painting, The Chess Game, which you see there on the right, may be the first documented Renaissance group portrait of just women. It provides a sense of interdependency between the girls and her family. As the scholar Michael Coles pointed out, each sibling looks to her older sister, with the second oldest looking out at Sofonisba, who would have been painting the image, and of course we take her place as the viewer. This intellectual approach to her painting practice and her erudite upbringing prepared her well for her eventual role at the Spanish Habsburg court in Madrid. There she served as lady-in-waiting, portraitist, and painting teacher to the Queen Isabel del Valois, and then after Isabel's death as a member of the court of Anne of Austria. Sofonisba was famous during her own lifetime, due in part to her prolific output of self-portraits, most of which show her engaging in learned activities such as reading, playing musical instruments, and painting. It has been posited that she created more self-portraits than any other European artist between Albert Dürer and Rembrandt. Around 1559, her likeness appears on a portrait medal, a relatively easily replicated and circulated medium that was likely commissioned to mark her invitation to the Habsburg court. But it is also an indication of her fame, as it is the first known medal to portray a woman artist. This degree of fame lasted throughout her lifetime. The Flemish painter and portraitist par excellence, Anthony van Dyck, made the point of visiting Anguissola during his travels around Italy in the 1620s. During his visit to Palermo in Sicily, where Anguissola spent her last years, Van Dyck made a sketch of her the year before she died. You can see that there on the right. He recounted that Anguissola was, quote, still with a good memory, quick spirit, and kind. Although her eyesight was weakened through age, it was a great pleasure for her to have pictures placed in front of her, and while she then placed her nose very close to the painting with a lot of effort, she managed to recognize some of it. She enjoyed that very much. When I drew her portrait, she gave me several hints. Not to get too close, too high, or too low, so the shadows and her wrinkles would not show so much. Her greatest sorrow was not to be able to paint anymore because of her failing eyesight, but her hand was steady without any trembling. Van Dyck's account suggests that Anguissola remained an artistic celebrity and mentor until the end. Though Anguissola was known primarily as a portraitist, there are surviving works that show her producing religious subject matter, such as the painting in the Lowe's collection. It comes from the later years of Anguissola's career, after she had left the Habsburg court in Madrid and married a ship captain, Orazio Lomellino, who brought her to the Maritime Republic of Genoa. Together they lived in Genoa from 1580 to 1615, then moved to Sicily, where she lived out her remaining years. Painted while she was resident in Genoa, the Lowe's painting appears to have been an interpreted copy after a composition of the same subject by Luca Cambiaso, who was the leading Genoese painter of the mid-16th century. So we have some examples of his work there on the right, painted work, and then a drawing there in the middle. Let's see here. While Cambiaso's painting does not appear to have survived, a drawing attributed to him shows the design for the central figural group. The addition of the chubby St. John by the candle and the yarn winder incorporate details found in other works of Cambiaso. But the small dog, so there's a little detail over here, right? The small dog sitting on an unfurled cartolino, little piece of paper, bearing the artist's signature, may have been Anguissola's invention. This lamplit presentation of the Holy Family surrounding the Christ child has many similarities with Cambiaso's painting Madonna of the Candle, and Anguissola's painting may have been intended as a combination of his various motifs. The Lowe's painting is one of a handful that we know Sofonisba made in the style of Cambiaso during this period, adopting his trademark combination of classicizing proportions and stylized anatomical details. This intersection of the two artist styles is interesting in light of the fact that Sofonisba had arrived from the Spanish court just a few years before Cambiaso left to paint in Madrid for Philip II, where Cambiaso then later died 2 years after. Cambiaso and Anguissola may have met each other in Genoa in the brief intervening years, but it does appear that Sofonisba adopted Cambiaso's subject matter and visual language in his absence. Rather than see the Lowe's painting as derivative, however, it could also be understood as not just an homage to Genoa's major painter, but also a calculated maneuver to establish herself within the artistic community of her adopted city. It is also worth noting that Sofonisba was now part of a wealthy Genoese household, and did not need to rely on painting portraits to earn her keep, so she would have been free to pursue other types of subjects. Choosing Cambiaso as her model was a shrewd gesture that acknowledged Genoa's artistic legacy and also showcased her ability to paint religious subjects that put her on equal footing with her male artistic peers. Historical subjects, here are those hierarchies, were considered the most respected of the top of the pictorial genres because they typically required a command of the depiction of the human body based upon carefully drawn observation. Development of this skill was not typically allowed for women artists, as it required access to live new models, something that was severely restricted and deemed wholly inappropriate, even dangerous, for any women of society. By adopting Cambiaso's figurative style in her religious history works, Anguissola was able to just demonstrate her worth as a serious artist. In many ways, Anguissola's professional trajectory reflects the expectations of the time for artists seeking recognition for their talents, but her experience was also unlike that of most creative women of her time. As a woman artist during the pre-modern period, Anguissola was exceptional in that she received a classically based literate education and had a family that supported these pursuits. Aspiring women artists were usually trained by an artistic father or family member. Sofonisba again was exceptional in that she was sent to a local painter to whom she was not related for her training. She was allowed to travel to Spain to join the Habsburg royal court, where she could pursue a professional identity as a court painter in addition to her role as lady-in-waiting. She was expected to marry eventually, but it wasn't the sole definer of her identity or purpose. She did not have any children, and she did not end up in a convent. In all these respects, Sofonisba's experience was exceptional, even considered unnatural by contemporary standards. Exceptional qualities were required figures included in historical compendia about artists. The perceived unnatural state of the few women artists who achieved professional reputations like hers earned them entry into the category of exceptionalism. The term exceptional evokes notions of genius, celebrity, innovation, and quality, which it turns out are all gatekeeping concepts that were constructed for and by a privileged class of men as ideological cornerstones of the Western artistic canon. This myth of exceptionalism in the history of Western European art arguably originates with the 16th century Florentine painter Giorgio Vasari, who was recognized as the progenitor of art historical biography as an independent genre. His biographical compendium, The Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, first published in 1550, and then again in a revised and expanded edition in 1568, promoted creative genius independent of manual craft. In short, the Vasarian model championed male artists making big art about important subjects. His focus on heroic and individual deeds of creativity, manifested in large-scale paintings and sculpture, categorically excluded those who worked in collaborative, non-professional, or personal creative sites of production, such as convents, manufactories, and the home. These locations also happened to be where the majority of women makers worked, having been restricted from participating in guilds, academies, salons, and other artistic institutions seeking to promote the intellectual authority of art. Due to Sofonisba's novel exceptionality as a famous woman painter, she was included in the second edition of The Lives, though it must be said, only as part of other artist entries, despite the fact that Vasari visited the Anguissola home in Cremona after she was already internationally famous. The few lines Vasari affords her note that Sofonisba, quote, labored at the difficulties of design with greater study and better grace than any other women of our time. Likely included as much as a typology as a specific individual, Anguissola's narrative, as constructed by Vasari, fed directly into the prevailing gendered narrative around exceptionalism that afforded her the opportunity to be included in the biographic compendia of her time, and ultimately in the modern-day pantheon of so-called great artists. Her remarkable achievements and the fact that we know of them indicate that she was one of the few women artists who found a way to play by the rules that were established by men for men. Indeed, Sofonisba was one of the pioneers who inspired subsequent generations of women artists, such as Lavinia Fontana, Artemisia Gentileschi, and other major women European painters of the subsequent centuries who earned favor at royal courts, traveled great distances without their families, and navigated restrictions that excluded them from traditional paths of artistic education and professionalism. Much ink has been spilled documenting their remarkable careers, but these exceptional stories are not the only ones worth telling. Sofonisba's story, in fact, is not reflective of the majority of women involved in the production of visual art during this period. Many of their largely anonymous or less documented lives were decidedly unexceptional by contemporary standards, but they proved to be far more integral to the artistic process of pre-modern Europe that has been traditionally acknowledged. Despite their historic lack of access to the same kinds of training and promotion that male artists enjoyed, women nevertheless worked in nearly every category of creative culture. Exploring this broader context of women's creativity allow us to consider the exceptional artists like Sofonisba Anguissola alongside her female contemporaries, to better understand how exceptional and unexceptional women artists alike contributed to a wider landscape of artistic production during the pre-modern period. These exceptional and unexceptional stories were part of the conception behind this exhibition that I co-organized in 2023-24 at the Baltimore Museum of Art and the Art Gallery of Ontario. In our research for this exhibition, we encountered objects and images that told many different stories. The exhibition Making Her Mark was intended as an ambitious corrective to widely held, if not always openly acknowledged, assumptions that women artists of this period were rare, or what they made was not of the same significance as those by their male counterparts. The result of nearly 5 years of research and consultation, the exhibition brought together over 230 works produced by women makers during the early modern era. In doing so, we endeavored to prompt questions about which artists and artworks are featured in museums and why others historically have not received this prominence. In its purposefully broad chronological, geographical, and material scope, Making Her Mark sought to make visible historical women who produced across media, within the lauded high art categories as well as those typically categorized as material culture, to examine how materiality and gender were linked both in the past and still are today in museum practice. As the subtitle of the exhibition suggests, my collaborators and I wanted to offer an alternative history of European art, one that prioritized examples of women's creativity and contributions to artistic production outside of the traditional metrics that overtly or unconsciously compared their works to the standards developed by and applied to male artists. By presenting these objects together in over a dozen media, including painting, sculpture, drawing, printmaking, ceramics, weaving and embroidering, wax, paper rolling, manuscript illumination, lace making, silversmithing, and furniture design, among others, we hope to change the way we think today about women makers of the past. Despite a robust body of feminist scholarly work spanning the last 50 years, organizing this exhibition made clear how our collective cultural perspective of the past continues to be shaped by biases towards the narrative of individual male genius. As such, Making Her Mark sought to challenge the established norms around the enduring romanticized notion of singular genius and its sexist implications for the history of Western art. The biographic, or even what one might call hagiographic approach to art history, exemplified by Vasari and his legacy, established a polemical and exclusionary rubric for centuries still reflected today in the popularity of the monographic publication or exhibition. That women's names do not appear in equal measure in the laudatory artistic biographies of both the past and the present is an indicator of this pervasive bias, both in terms of an artist's gender and the type of work created, which tend to be linked. Further, this focus on individual creativity on a grand scale contributed to the dominance of large-scale painting and sculpture, artistic formats regarded as the apex of the hierarchy of media and overwhelmingly dominated by male makers. For the exhibition, we expanded our inquiries beyond the familiar critical mechanisms to include more personal and circumstance-specific examples of making that reveal frequently overlooked aspects of female creativity and labor across media, including women's involvement in the management and entrepreneurial aspects of art making, as well as women's roles wholly unacknowledged in procuring material goods used in artistic production. Many of the objects in the exhibition had no individual maker names associated with them, and many of them were likely the result of forced or unpaid labor at some or all stages of their production. While we remain in the dark about these undocumented makers, the inclusion of their finished products in the exhibition served as a way to reclaim their essential contributions to exceptional objects. To convey the rich variety of contexts and media represented by named and unnamed women alike, we organized the exhibition into 4 conceptual themes that allowed us to examine women's engagement with different chapters of European society and history through a multimedia approach. This organizational structure also disrupted the traditional practice of categorizing individual artists into regional or stylistic schools, or adhering to a linear chronology. Where we could, we attempted to undermine notions of individual genius with a paintbrush or a chisel. By presenting tapestries alongside ceramics, laced with large-scale paintings, and embroidered objects next to silverwork, we drew attention to the historical reality that every work of art, without or with an identified name assigned to it, is the result of collaborative labor that involved women. Rather than fixate on works by exceptional artists, we chose instead to spotlight exceptional objects that collectively reveal broader narratives about the women who made them. Each theme had subsections within them that further illustrated not only the span of women's contributions, but also allowed for deeper investigation into areas that have received far less attention in scholarship and invited visitors to consider women's engagement within various historical contexts. I'm going to quickly take us through the various different subsections, but in the interest of time, I'll just provide some overviews with a few highlighted examples that illustrate the myriad contributions of exceptional and non-exceptional women alike. The first section presented works by women that addressed the themes of faith and power. The works illustrated that women of all socioeconomic levels worked for the highest echelons of European society: royal courts, noble households, papal patronage, and the Catholic Church. While Lavinia Fontana, whose portrait is down here in the lower right, was establishing herself in the late 16th century as a portraitist to the moneyed classes of Bologna, other women and girls were pressed into the labor of lace production, typically manufactured in convents or orphanages across Europe by undocumented women at the lowest social stratum. Concurrently, some women achieved managerial roles in major artistic manufactories, such as Maria Maddalena della Riviera, who directed the Barberini tapestry manufactory in Rome during the 17th century. And you can see an example of that work over here. Or they operated as independent business owners, such as the 18th century British silversmith Hester Bateman, who collaborated with the Jewish communities in Portsmouth and London to produce silver ritual objects. Women artists, such as the Portuguese painter Josefa Ayala de Obidos or the Spanish sculptor Luisa Roldan, produced devotional imagery for domestic settings, and they often specialized in subject matters such as the Virgin Mary, meant specifically for Catholic female audiences. The convent was also a site of making in which cloistered women produced works for their own use, such as this enormous antiphonal manuscript on the left, and I'm talking this big, right? The sucker weighed about 50 pounds, we had two of them. They were used for collective prayer, or as objects that nuns could sell to pilgrims and the devout as a means to support their convent. And I'll draw your attention here to this gilded reliquary. It makes clear that the nuns often use the most modest materials. In this case, they cut the the gilded foredges off of books in their libraries. Everything inside of this frame is rolled paper. Okay? So they would sell these things to create these spectacular devotional objects. The second section examined the concept of interiority, both as a state of mind as well as a place. Included are objects that women made for themselves, each other, their families, and friends. Several objects demonstrate that many women of means had rich intellectual lives, sustained through the study of music, literature, languages, and other fields. Some women were even able to pursue formal studies at universities, although very few of them were awarded official degrees for their work, such as the numismatist Gabriella Cololo-Petina, and we have a print here with her portrait. She actually, I believe, went to the University of Padua. She completed the entire course of study, and then at the very end they said, actually, we can't give you the degree. I would have burned the place down. She, I think, probably pivoted and commissioned Susanna Maria von Sundert to create this print as kind of her graduation certificate. Utilitarian objects produced within the domestic setting often reflected personal relationships, such as this fantastic 18th century cabinet, decorated by the Bonnell sisters-in-law with thousands of hand-rolled and dyed pieces of paper to replicate marquetry patterns. So everything you see here covering this is paper, and then here in the roundels, that's actually embroidered seams, and it's made from hair. Yeah, here's what you got. Extraordinary and often touching examples of embroidery convey the labor women did to clothe their families and decorate their homes. Embroidery, in particular, was a fascinating way to track the generally overlooked connection of women and girls through the circulation of pattern books across the European continent and beyond, something that we came to call the needlework network. Luxury objects that women of means purchased for their homes from professional women makers also provided insight into women's involvement in the commercial aspect of artistic production. The role of the widow, especially in the areas of silver, ceramics, and furniture production, is a topic ripe for further investigation. So if anyone's out there looking for a dissertation topic, come see me. Yeah? The third section took us into the natural world and women's engagement with the early history of science. Here we took on two enduring bromides of art history: that still life painting was uniquely suited to women due to its less demanding intellectual requirements, not true, and that women rarely engaged with the depiction of the human body and therefore could not become important artists, also not true. We demonstrated that women, like the Dutch still life painter Maria van Oosterwijk, were deeply involved in the scientific communities that informed their aesthetic interpretations of botanical imagery. Floral varietals and hybrids developed in greenhouses across Europe were replicated by 45 women and girls employed in the Sèvres porcelain factory in a workshop headed by Marie-Henriette Gravant. And I'll just give you a little fun note. So these are how we received the porcelain flowers, just loose, in a box. So we had to figure out how to display them. So what we did is we took an image of a woman drawing in the garden, and we blew it up really large, and then our really, really talented art handlers figured out little individual mounts that we then pierced through the image. So we were able to give this sense of indoor-outdoor. These flowers also would have been, in the 18th century when they were created, arranged into bouquets to have in the home, and the stems would often be tagged with perfumed paper that smelled like the flower that was being portrayed. So you had this sensorial experience as well. So we were also fortunate to be able to include drawings that illustrated numerous examples of women artists, such as the 18th century artists Mary Moser and Julia Lama, who pursued the study of the human body through unofficial means of access to live models, whether studying their own bodies or the bodies of family and friends in their lives. Women's roles in the history of Western science, particularly in the fields of zoology, entomology, anatomy, and astronomy, among others, have long been understudied. Clara Eimart grew up viewing the night skies alongside her astronomer father in their family observatory in Nuremberg, and created a series of 350 drawings of the phases of the moon as seen through the telescope. There's an example there. That is also quite large, so she made 350 drawings about this size. Maria Sibylla Merian had a special relationship with caterpillars, which she raised in her home over several years in order to study their cycle of metamorphosis. Her deep interest in insects took her and her daughter, Dorothea Maria, as far as Suriname, then a Dutch colony, to engage with the native flora and fauna and translate their observations and illustrations into a publication that has long been recognized as foundational in the field of etymology. Though Sarah Stone never left England, and this is her work here on the right, which I hear is special in this area. Yeah, we show up sometimes, right? Cool. So though she never left England, her employment to document Ashton Beaver's Museum of Ethnographic and Natural Specimens put her in contact with taxidermy birds that would be brought from around the world, and this established a career as a natural illustrator. Impressive as these accomplishments are, it also underscores the relationship of female scientific illustrators to the colonial practices of enslavement and extraction that facilitated their access to these specimens. In general, women artists of this period continue to be overlooked as active participants in international and global exchange. The last section celebrated the entrepreneurial spirit of the many women who established themselves in the business of making art, within their communities as well as on an international scale. The Grand Tour offered a stage on which the pastelist Rosalba Carriera could launch an international career, known for her arrestingly fresh pastel portraits and allegorical figures made for visitors stopping in Venice as part of their itineraries. The textile designs of Anna Maria Garthwaite enjoyed global attention. Her botanically inspired patterns were woven into clothing textiles in the manufactories of London's Spitalfields neighborhood, but then traveled with settlers to the North American colonies, where they were regarded as high fashion and passed down within families for generations. The dress we were able to borrow that you see there on the screen actually came to us from colonial Williamsburg. So it was a family that was then part of what became Rhode Island. They brought it over from England and then continued to pass it down. Technical prowess secured the reputations of Maria Caterina Prestel and Mary Linwood. Prestel developed an innovative multi-plate technique that earned her recognition in the field of reproductive printmaking in Germany and London. while Linwood displayed her genre-defining needle paintings in her own gallery in Leicester Square and toured around the British Isles. So I will just point out, that is not a painting, that is entirely embroidery. I know, right? It's always amazing to me. Whether in the world of printmaking, textile design, pastels, or embroidery, these women established professional reputations in their lifetimes that span the European continent as well as the transatlantic world. In the last gallery, we addressed those who achieved recognized professional status through state-sponsored salons and national academies. By the later 18th century, the restrictions against women's involvement in formal artistic institutions began to relax, and we start to see a generational effect of established women artists training other women. Anne Garret's inspiring depiction of a fellow female student illustrates the increasing presence of women learning to draw from models in the academic setting. It's a little bit hard to see, but if you look closely at the drawing, it's a male nude that's dressed up as an angel. As one of the founding members of London's Royal Academy, Angelica Kaufmann displayed history paintings regularly in annual exhibitions. Marie-Victoire Jacquetot's porcelain service of famous women, commissioned by Napoleon as a gift to Empress Josephine, who rejected it, celebrates the long history of women rulers, authors, and philosophers. Several works also illustrated how women took agency in the long-standing tradition of portraying a woman as artistic muse, and transformed it into bold statements about women as creative beings in their own right. Perhaps the most inspiring story is that of Sarah Biffen, who's here on the left, a self-taught miniaturist of working-class origins who gained fame on the English country fair circuit for her ability to paint portraits with only her mouth. She was born without hands or feet, a detail that she actually inscribes. It's hard to see, but it's just down here under her portrait. She inscribes it on the self-portrait drawing. It says, by Sarah Biffen, drawn without hands. She dons a medal of honor for the Royal Society of Arts and fashionable clothes, and she presents herself in the same visual tradition as artists such as Titian and Rembrandt, claiming her place in that history of self-portraiture. We were thrilled to be able to borrow 3 works by Sofonisba Anguissola to include in the exhibition. 2 demonstrated her significance in the history of elite portraiture, and 1 we felt spoke intimately to the importance of women's social and material networks. The 2 male portraits here date from the beginnings of her professional career, when she was commissioned to depict young noblemen according to standards established for court portraiture. The Stampa portrait, the one in the middle, painted before she was called to Madrid, captures the tentative, even terrified expression of a young Italian marquis who has lost his father and inherited his title. The princess portrait on the right shows a potential monarch in the dazzling trappings of green velvet and lace, holding a bejeweled sword and spear that speak to his future place on the Spanish throne. The portrait of Minerva on the left is a different matter. While it may capture the likeness of Anguissola's sister, it allowed us to explore the connection between her sister's name, Minerva, goddess of wisdom, learning, and weaving, and the prevalence of women involved in textile arts. The emphasis on the woven embellishments in the sitter's collar and cuffs speaks to the central importance of needlework and weaving in recuperating the history of largely anonymous women's creative contributions to pre-modern European art. Including such a portrait as this also served as a compelling reminder to look to costume and material details in portraits, regardless of who painted them, to draw out the less obvious stories of women makers. Our desire to resurface the stories and circumstances surrounding these women's artistic contributions is not a new one. Generations of feminist scholars, spurred on by the art historian Linda Nochlund's landmark call in 1971 to consider why there had been no great women artists, established entire fields of feminist scholarship, and laudable exhibitions focused on women artists. But many of these efforts have been devoted to rediscovering women who achieved the narrative of exceptionalism through the celebrated art of painting. This is not surprising, since women painters were the majority of what we were taught in art history classes, if women were included at all, further supporting the assumption that women artists of the past were rare. Indeed, at the beginning of our own planning and research, we realized that we had internalized these same biases. Early in the research phase, we feared we couldn't find enough works by women to support a major exhibition. We could not have been more wrong. During the planning process, which we did during the pandemic, we considered over 900 works of art, and we wrote over 400 loan requests. Because many of these objects are not readily on view, we spent a lot of time in storerooms and warehouses across the United States and Canada and in 7 European countries. Carrying out the research to identify works by women makers meant not only questioning our own preconceptions, but also sometimes convincing our colleagues that objects in their collections were actually the result of women's work. To be clear, very few of the objects included in the exhibition were utterly new discoveries. Most of them had been published or were cataloged within the institutions that housed them, but often they had not been on view for many years, or they had not been considered within the context of women's creativity. The reasoning for the siloing effect has everything to do with their diverse materiality and the categories that have defined the way objects are displayed in art museums according to the entrenched narrative of singular artistic genius. Abandoning our presumptions about what it meant to be a great artist and what kind of objects qualify as art worthy of displaying in a museum opened up a world of possibilities. Expanding beyond the single artist-focused format that prioritizes large-scale painting, we aim to meet these women on their own terms, discovering their contributions through the works they made in settings adjacent to or entirely outside of the male-dominated academy and studio. Rather than cling to highly gendered and exclusionary notions of quality or genius, we subscribe instead to a philosophy of inclusiveness and generosity. Instead of limiting our understanding of the past through the binary lens of who and what are worthy of being in or out of the canon, this exhibition has shown the rich potential of approaching curatorial research with a yes-and attitude. We were fully aware that this attitude rankles against centuries of tradition. We did not reject concepts of beauty, skill, or accomplishment. Rather, we presented a range of objects so that they may resonate with audiences through differing modes of emotional, intellectual, spiritual, and aesthetic pleasure, reflecting the human spirit on multiple levels as memorable and affecting art always has. We also realized that researching women artists required questioning many of our own ingrained traditional research methods, which largely did not allow for consideration of these so-called unexceptional women makers because their information was never meant to be captured in the traditional biographic format. Even the parameters by which historians operate depends on basic data, such as a name, birth and death dates, or a body of work, and these are often absent when considering the role of creative women of the past, as well as women involved in the subsequent history of an object. Even in the case of Sofonisba, who's been the subject of several exhibitions and book-length studies, we still don't know her exact birth date. The lessons learned from working on this exhibition have shown that women are imbricated at multiple levels of an object's history, from its conception and fabrication to the history of its ownership. It is up to the current and future generations of curators, scholars, researchers, and visitors to keep asking, where are the women? Each object potentially serves as a portal to various pathways we can reveal the presence of women in museums, both as makers as well as collection builders and custodians. To return to the Lowe's painting, while we are fortunate to know that it was created by a woman due to the signature on the canvas, I'd like to point out that there are several other women's stories that are entwined with the work. So this painting came to the Lowe as a gift from Mrs. Forbes Hawk, right? So she is actually there on the left. She gave it in 1952. I bring this up to illustrate how researching historical women often encounters a specific hurdle. Their names change, sometimes multiple times over the course of their lives in a way that men's tend not to. This erasure of a woman's birth name frequently complicates our efforts to track their stories. Unless these shifts in nomenclature are recorded, and Sofonisba helpfully does this by signing the Lowe's painting with both her maiden and married name, there is always the risk of the loss of knowledge. In the case of Mrs. Cox, I did a little digging with John's help to elucidate the connection between her gift of the painting and its history of ownership. As a result, I learned a little bit about Mrs. Cox and her family along the way. According to her obituaries in the Miami Herald and the New York Times, Mrs. Forbes Hawks was born Alice Silliman Belknap, and you can see, this is all just genealogy websites, nothing scary, you all can find it yourselves. She held a degree from Vassar College and was a suffragist active in Long Island. Yay. The painting appears to have come into her position from her mother, and I don't have a picture of her mother, but there is her gravestone, Alice Trumbull Silliman, whose grandfather Benjamin Silliman was a professor of chemistry at Yale, and he purchased the painting from the Lomellino family in Genoa during his travels in Europe, and you can see that's noted here on this card that was part of the record of the painting. His wife, Harriet Trumbull Silliman, was the niece of John Trumbull, often referred to as the painter of the American Revolution, who depicted such major figures and events of the era, such as the presentation of the draft of the Constitution to Congress, which now hangs in the U.S. Capitol. So through Harriet's connection to John Trumbull, Yale acquired all of his paintings, which resulted in the founding in 1832 of the Trumbull Gallery, the first university art gallery in the United States. I'm sure you did not come here thinking you'd learn about the founding of the United States government in relationship to a Renaissance painting. Well, it seems like we've gotten off track in the investigation of the Lowe's painting. It nevertheless illustrates how following female histories can shed new light on the works in the collection and connections to broader developments in the history of collecting. As museums are addressing the absence of women on their walls, they can often make headway when they pursue the stories of women in the history of their collection's formation. The challenges of finding women in the history of pre-modern European art may seem to support the assumption upheld by generations of scholars and museum professionals that women artists were rare, but it merely means we need to find another way to locate them. If an institution is not so lucky as this one to have assigned work by women artists, they can pursue paths through research and expansive thinking around the works they do have. Making her mark showed that shifting our perspectives and methods can yield remarkable results. In our pursuit to bring forward the stories of women, exceptional and unexceptional alike, we hope to have offered some ways to reframe the history of European art. Thank you.